Hallo, allemaal.
Oh my god, they're speaking Dutch. Well, it seems Tears of the Kingdom is not the reboot or reimagining some of us thought it was, and today I thought I'd give you my 2 cents on it. So for those who missed it, in a recent interview conducted by Famitsu, series director Hidemaru Fujibayashi shared some of his insights into the timeline placement of Breath of the Wild and its sequel. And honestly, this came as a pretty big surprise to me. Due to the way Tears of the Kingdom was written, I was convinced that the Zelda team's intention was to completely distance themselves from the original timeline as much as possible, maybe even going as far as rewriting history altogether. It's long been debated whether or not the team actually wanted or cared about an established timeline for the series to begin with, or if this was just done to satisfy the fans. Those pesky, nagging fans, like me. Personally, I think it's a little bit of both. Nintendo isn't exactly known to give in to fan pressure and feedback, so if they really didn't want a timeline to exist, they would have insisted that these are all disconnected stories, like Final Fantasy. They would also not enable fans further by publishing a book about it. Not to mention, it was Miyamoto and Tezuka who started suggesting a chronological order for the games publicly back in the 90s. But of course, that was back then, when there were, I think, only 5 games total. CDI games not included, of course. Nowadays, we have more than 20 games to work with, and many prominent figures from the early days like Tezuka and Miyamoto are no longer part of the Zelda dev team. If you were to ask me, I think Nintendo lost track of a definitive order around the mid to late 2000s. They did acknowledge the timeline split brought forth by Ocarina of Time and even played into the idea of 2 separate realities, as Majora's Mask followed up on the events of Link traveling back to his childhood, and Wind Waker portrays the world he left behind. But I guess at some point they realized they had all these other games laying around which somehow had to be retrofitted into the chronology as well, like the games made by Capcom and the NES titles, many of which didn't really fit with everything else anymore. And so they came up with a band-aid solution, and that solution was the infamous third timeline split, which is essentially a dumping ground for all the games that didn't fit in with the rest. And it really shows. It's mostly comprised of older titles, and to no one's surprise, it's by far the most inconsistent branch of the timeline. Not that the rest of the timeline is perfect by any means, but for the most part, it works. Then of course we got Skyward Sword, which is a prequel to, well, everything. So this one was an easy fit. Conversely, we have Breath of the Wild, a sequel to everything. And the idea of placing it so far in the future that everything that came before is a distant myth which barely has any impact on current events was a pretty clever way to start fresh. It allowed for a clean slate for the series without messing up its legacy. But then Tears of the Kingdom made it complicated again by incorporating time travel. And not just any time travel, but literally going back to Hyrule's founding, technically shortly after it was founded. Now, if you're someone who's well versed in the Zelda timeline, you know that Hyrule's founding is something that happened very early in the chronology, sometime after Skyward Sword and before Minish Cap. Also, Ganondorf wasn't born yet during Hyrule's founding. It would be eons before he came into the picture in Ocarina of Time. So you can imagine people's surprise when Rauru introduced himself as the first king of Hyrule. And I think this and some other moments in the story that seem to mimic set pieces from previous titles made a lot of people lean more towards the idea that this could indeed be a reimagining, particularly a reimagining of Ocarina of Time and to a lesser extent a Link to the Past story, given the whole, imprisoning war stuff. And that all the references to the older games are just that, references to give longtime fans of the series a sense of familiarity, which is at least partially true either way, timeline or not. And just to clarify, I would have been okay with it if it was a reboot. It's not my favorite solution, but the original timeline is a bit of a mess, and I definitely don't see it as something sacred that must never be disregarded. Of course, when it comes to Tears of the Kingdom, it was to be expected that someone would eventually bring up the timeline question at some point, but I figured they would either cleverly dodge it with some ambiguous statement, refuse to comment altogether, or they would straight up confirm that yes, we're starting over. It's a reimagining of the original timeline in a way. But surprisingly, that's not what happened. So what exactly did Fujibayashi have to say about the timeline? Well, he presents the idea that even though we witness Hyrule in its infancy, it's possible that it's not the same kingdom seen in previous titles. The old kingdom of Hyrule and its long history could have been destroyed before Rauru established his rule in this new land, and most likely even before the arrival of the Zonai in general, which was actually already a running theory. And it wouldn't be the first time either, since in the Wind Waker, Hyrule is also destroyed, only for a new kingdom to pop up in Spirit Tracks called New Hyrule, which is on a different different continent no less. It is worth pointing out that Fujibayashi presents this as a what if, using phrases like is it possible, so it's not like he's outright saying this is how it is. But I mean, he is obviously trying to nudge us in the right direction here, at least that's the impression I get. While it's not an outright confirmation, keep in mind that this is how the Zelda team has always approached the lore. It's quite rare to find definitive answers from Nintendo when it comes to anything regarding the Zelda timeline. It's always phrased in a way that change remains a possibility and nothing is absolute. In that sense, the official timeline as a whole is a suggestion, a foundation fans can use to build upon, which I think has always been a good setup. When it comes to grander mythologies in fiction, I will choose ambiguity over cold hard facts any day of the week. It gives fans who are invested in the lore something to work with and at the same time ample amount of room to do their own research and interpret the lore in their own unique way. In fact, when you think about it, if the Zelda timeline was clearly spelled out, no gaps, no inconsistencies, no room to fill in the missing pieces, then no one would ever even discuss the timeline. I mean, what's the point if all the facts are already laid out by the developers? It's exactly because the timeline is an unsolved puzzle fueled by Nintendo's ambiguity that people still talk about it today. As for the statements made by Fujibayashi, I think under the current circumstances, this is probably the most satisfying answer we could have gotten. I truly believe that. It suggests that the original timeline is still relevant. All these other stories and events, they still happened. Midna might still be out there somewhere. We stopped an angry moon from crashing into the earth. And Tingle did end up in jail like the criminal he is. Tears of the Kingdom didn't change or rewrite history. Nothing is lost. Breath of the Wild and its sequel reside in their own little space at the very end of it all. I think it satisfies most people. Not all of them, of course, you can't please everyone. But if you don't care about timelines or even the story in general, great. The games will no doubt continue to follow the same trajectory, where you don't have to play any of the previous titles to understand what's going on. In that sense, most Zelda games are already kind of a reboot, or a soft reboot, I guess is a more appropriate term. Meanwhile, those who are invested in the overarching lore and mythology can continue to speculate and express their creative thinking, because despite Fujibayashi's statements, we are far from solving all the mysteries. For starters, if Hyrule was utterly destroyed only to be re-established by Rauru far in the future, then which part of the timeline does it follow up on? The downfall, child or adult timeline? A brand new reality? Or did the existing realities converge at some point, and if so, how and why? Also, where was the Master Sword in Rauru's time, and what became of the Triforce? Technically, there's only one timeline branch where the Kingdom of Hyrule was destroyed and the Master Sword and Triforce disappeared, all at the same time, which would be the adult timeline. Hyrule did fall into decay in the Downfall timeline, but in Zelda 2, which is the last game in that reality, the kingdom and its monarchy are still alive and kicking. But then, on the flip side, in Breath and Tears there's items, enemies and references present which originate from all three realities, which of course hints more at the idea of some kind of convergence. These are all unanswered questions and mysteries we can continue to investigate, and at least now we can do so without having to worry about the possibility that it's all a massive retcon and the old games don't matter anymore. I feel like that's the most important thing here. Even if Fujibayashi's statements are just him improvising on the spot, it doesn't take away from the fact that he seems to favor the idea that it fits in the original timeline somehow. If it was meant to be a reboot, he would have just said so. After all, it's by far the easiest answer to give. Also, this might just be me, but I kinda like the idea of Hyrule being this stubborn kingdom that just refuses to die. No matter how much it gets devastated, it always manages to rise from the ash once again, like a phoenix. It's almost as if it has to exist, and the universe is like correcting itself or something. Even in real life, civilizations rise and fall, but they never disappear completely. Even when something new takes its place, it still inherits traditions, art, language, and other aspects from that which came before. And so does Hyrule. The kingdom we see in Minish Cap or Ocarina of Time are far removed from later renditions seen in The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and ultimately the Era of the Wild, to a point where it might as well be a different place altogether. But there will always be things that survive across the ages, be it symbols, names, or traditions. Either way, I'm very excited to see the theories and ideas people come up with in the near future, and if I have my own, you can bet that I'll be making videos about it too. But for now, that's all I have to say. In case you're wondering, yes, I'm still working on my Zonai Sheikah Connections video. I'm probably gonna have to do some rewrites or add certain parts because I may or may not have made some assumptions about the timeline of events here and there, which of course have now become obsolete. But I'm quite far into production already, so it shouldn't take too much longer, I hope. I also have a few shorts planned out to fill in the gaps between videos. I figured I might as well join the trend, and I have a pretty special announcement regarding merch coming up as well, so plenty to look forward to. Anyway, thank you for listening to my rambling, and have a great day.